The measure of a warrior is not found in the uniform they wear, but in the silence after the battle, when the ones who doubted finally understand. The rain had been falling on Fort Bragg for 3 days straight, turning the training grounds into a labyrinth of mud and memory. Major Sarah Keane stood at the window of the briefing room, watching the water run in silver rivulets down the glass, and remembered another rain, in a mountain village where the air smelled of cordite and pine, where she'd called in fire support while dragging a wounded teammate through knee-deep snow. That was 7 years ago. A lifetime. A different war. Now she stood in pressed ACUs, her gold oak leaves catching the fluorescent light, waiting to meet the men she'd been assigned to command. The 5th Special Operations Training Group. 63 operators, all veterans of Tier 1 units, all hardened by deployments she'd never discuss in casual conversation. They were being reorganized under her leadership for a new classified program that would reshape how American special operators trained foreign partner forces. The problem, of course, was that none of them knew who she was, what she'd done, where she'd been. Sarah turned from the window as the door opened. Command Sergeant Major William Drake entered first, broad-shouldered, silver at the temples, with the kind of eyes that had seen too much to be impressed by anything. Behind him came the team leaders and senior NCOs, filing into the rows of metal chairs with the casual efficiency of men who'd done this 1,000 times. She watched them take their seats, watched them notice her standing at the front, watched the glances they exchanged, the slight narrowing of eyes, the almost imperceptible set of jaws. She'd seen that look before, many times. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice steady and clear, "I'm Major Sarah Keane, effective immediately. I'll be commanding this unit as we transition into the Forge program." A hand went up in the third row. Master Sergeant Ryan Dalton. She'd memorized their service records, their faces, their deployment histories. Silver Star. 4 combat rotations. The kind of soldier who'd earned every tab through blood and frozen nights. "Ma'am," his voice was flat, professionally neutral. "No disrespect, but what's your operational background? Most of the command element here comes from CAG or the regiment." There it was. The question that always came, wrapped in courtesy but sharp enough to cut. Sarah let the silence stretch for a moment. She could feel the weight of their skepticism, could see it in the way they sat, arms crossed, spines straight, waiting for her to prove what they already suspected, that she didn't belong here. "I spent 5 years with a unit that doesn't have a name you'd recognize," she said simply. "Before that, I was attached to elements operating in denied areas across 3 continents. My background is classified above your current read-on. What you need to know is that I've been where you're going. I know what works and what gets people killed. Any other questions?" The room went quiet. Denied areas. Elements without names. The kind of assignments that existed in the shadows of shadows. She saw the skepticism deepen. She understood. Anyone could claim anything. In the special operations community, credentials were proven, not proclaimed. Command Sergeant Major Drake leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 26 years in uniform. "Ma'am, with respect, my operators have been through the worst this world has to offer. They don't need theory. They need someone who understands what it costs to do this work." Sarah met his eyes. "I understand, Sergeant Major. And I'm not here to lecture. I'm here because the way we're training partner forces is getting good people killed. Ours and theirs. The Forge program exists to fix that. My job is to make sure we get it right." She turned and began outlining the program concept on the digital display, feeling their doubt like heat on her back. She'd known this would happen, had prepared for it in her own way. But preparation and reality are different things. That night, alone in her quarters, Sarah opened the small steel case she kept in her footlocker. Inside, wrapped in cloth, lay a tarnished challenge coin and a photograph. The coin bore no unit designation, just a single word in Cyrillic that translated roughly to shadow. The photograph showed a younger version of herself, standing with a group of bearded men in unmarked fatigues, mountains rising behind them, like broken teeth. She remembered their faces, remembered the sound of their laughter, their voices raised in argument over bitter tea, the way they'd looked at her when she'd first arrived. A woman, an American, sent to help coordinate their operations against an enemy that had already killed half their families. They doubted her too. At first. She closed the case and turned off the light. Tomorrow would come soon enough. The first week was difficult. The second week was worse. Sarah spent her mornings in the Tactical Operations Center, reviewing the unit's previous deployment reports, studying their methodologies, identifying the patterns that had worked and the patterns that had cost lives. She worked through lunches and stayed late into the evenings, building a training curriculum designed not to impress, but to transform. She knew what they thought of her. The walls in military installations were thin, and voices carried farther than people realized. She heard the dismissive comments, the speculation about how she'd gotten the assignment, the confident predictions that she'd be gone within 2 months. None of it was new. She'd heard it all before, in a dozen languages, on 4 continents. The words were different, but the melody was always the same, the ancient song of doubt, sung by people who couldn't. Imagine what they hadn't witnessed. Sarah could feel the resistance in everything, in the way the operators followed her directives with precise, minimal compliance, in the conversations that stopped when she approached, in the careful distance they maintained, as though proximity might suggest endorsement. She didn't blame them, not really. These men had earned their skepticism through years of service, through watching commanders come and go, through learning the hard way that not everyone who wore rank deserved respect. Trust, in their world, was not freely given. It was built, one moment at a time, through shared hardship and proven competence. She hadn't yet earned the right to it. On the morning of the 4th week, Sarah gathered the unit at the advanced training facility, a sprawling complex of shoot houses, mock villages, and terrain replication zones that had been designed to simulate the chaos of unconventional warfare. The rain had finally stopped, but the air was heavy with moisture, and fog clung to the tree line like smoke from a distant fire. Today, she announced, we're running a full partner force coordination exercise. Scenario is a joint raid with indigenous forces against a hardened target. Your partner element will be role-played by the Op 4 cadre. The challenge isn't the assault, it's the coordination. She paused, letting her eyes move across the assembled operators. I'll be running the indigenous force element. Command Sergeant Major Drake will be observing from the TOC. Any questions? Master Sergeant Dalton stepped forward. His voice carried no hostility, only the blunt practicality of a man who'd spent years operating in environments where half measures got people killed. Ma'am, I mean no disrespect, but playing the partner force against us. You understand? We've been doing joint operations for a long time. If you want to make it realistic, you might want to bring in some of the language-qualified support staff to help. Sarah held his gaze for a moment. I appreciate the concern, Master Sergeant, but I think I can manage. She turned and walked toward the staging area, leaving them to their preparations. Behind her, she heard low voices, murmurs she wasn't meant to catch. This should be interesting. Give her 30 minutes, maybe. The exercise began at 0600. Sarah had spent the previous 2 nights setting up the scenario, positioning the role players, establishing the cultural dynamics, building in the complications that real-world partner operations always presented. She'd drawn on every lesson she'd learned in places she couldn't name, working alongside fighters who'd been waging asymmetric warfare for generations. The first American element made contact with her indigenous force at 0618. By 0625, the coordination had already begun to fracture. Cultural misunderstandings, communication failures, the friction that always emerged when highly trained professionals tried to work with. Forces that operated on entirely different assumptions. Sarah played her role with devastating authenticity. She argued. She delayed. She made demands that seemed irrational but were rooted in the tribal dynamics she'd been embedding into the scenario. She watched the American operators struggle with frustration, watched their carefully planned timeline collapse, watched them face the reality of what partner force operations actually looked like in denied environments. At Seven's toe, the assault went in, poorly synchronized with the indigenous element moving too early, and the American Overwatch element caught out of position. The objective was secured, but the cost was high. Simulated casualties mounted. The target escaped through a route that proper coordination would have covered. Finally, at 0803, Command Sergeant Major Drake called a halt. The mission had succeeded technically, but everyone knew the truth. Sarah stepped out of her role and walked to meet them. The operators stood in loose formation, faces streaked with camouflage paint and frustration, eyes hard with a mixture of anger and, she thought, something that might be the beginning of reassessment. After action review in 30 minutes, she said. Bring your maps and your assumptions. The debrief lasted 4 hours. Sarah walked them through every decision point, every cultural miscue, every moment where American tactical excellence had collided with the reality of coalition warfare. She spoke without condescension, without smugness, just facts, just lessons, just the truth about what they'd face when they deployed under the Forge program. She told them about operations she'd participated in, stripped of identifying details, but rich with the texture of experience. The time a perfectly planned raid had nearly failed because no one understood the local concept of time. The mission that succeeded only because she'd spent 3 weeks living with a tribal militia, earning their trust before asking them to risk their lives. The extraction that went wrong because an American element had inadvertently insulted a village elder, and suddenly the partner force had become an obstacle rather than an asset. When it was over, Master Sergeant Dalton lingered as the others filed out. He stood before her, not at attention, but not casual either, the posture of a man working through something. "Ma'am," he paused, choosing his words. "That scenario, the cultural dynamics, the way you played the indigenous commander, I've seen exactly that situation. In places where we thought we were the experts and the locals were just assets to be managed." Sarah nodded slowly. "I spent 2 years embedded with resistance forces in a country I'm not allowed to name. Before that, I was the only American on a joint task force operating in denied territory for 11 months. The people we're trying to help, they're not supporting characters in our operations. They're the main effort. We're just the enablers." Dalton was silent for a moment. "The unit with no name?" "Among other things," she said quietly. He nodded once, then turned and left. Something had shifted, not acceptance, not yet, but the first crack in the wall. That night, Sarah sat in the empty briefing room long after everyone else had gone. The coffee in her cup had grown cold, but she didn't notice. She was thinking about a woman named Fatima, a resistance leader who'd been the first to trust her when she'd arrived in a mountain camp. A woman who'd lost her husband and 2 brothers to the enemy, and had every reason to see another foreign advisor as just another broken promise. "Why should we follow you?" Fatima had asked, her eyes hard with generations of betrayal. "Your country has sent many advisors. They come, they talk, they leave. Our villages still burn." She hadn't had an answer then, not in words, so she'd shown her instead. She'd stayed when the others evacuated. She'd fought beside Fatima's people when the attack came. She'd carried a wounded fighter through 4 kilometers of enemy territory to reach the extraction point. By the end, Fatima had given her a name in her language, a word that meant the one who stays. It was the highest honor she could bestow on an outsider. Sarah still carried her photograph in that steel case, alongside the others who'd trusted her when trust had to be earned in blood. The weeks that followed were different. The operators still tested her. It was in their nature, part of who they were, but the tests had changed. They weren't trying to expose her anymore. They were trying to learn what she knew. Sarah taught them things that weren't in any manual: how to read a village by the way people moved through it, how to identify the real power structure in a tribal society, which often had nothing to do with official titles, how to build trust with partner forces who'd been lied to by every foreign power that had ever passed through their territory. These were lessons paid for in blood, not hers alone, but the blood of everyone she'd served alongside, everyone who'd trusted her with their lives in places where trust was the only currency that mattered. On the 7th week, during a night exercise, a young staff sergeant named Reeves approached her during a break. He was 27, with 3 deployments already behind him, but his eyes held the questioning of someone trying to understand something that didn't fit his existing framework. "Ma'am, can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." He hesitated, then pushed forward. "How do you do it? The things you've described, living with indigenous forces, operating in denied areas for months at a time, no support, no backup. How do you keep going when everything says you shouldn't be there?" Sarah looked up at the stars, pinpricks of light in the vast darkness. She thought about the question, really thought about it, because he deserved more than a comfortable abstraction. "You find the reason that's bigger than you," she said finally. "Not the mission brief, not the operational objective, the actual human reason. The people you're there to help, the lives that depend on getting it right. When everything else falls away, that's what keeps you moving." She turned to face him. "The hardest part isn't the danger. It's the loneliness. Operating in those environments, you're cut off from everything familiar. No one who looks like you, no one who thinks like you. You have to become something different to survive, and you have to remember who you were before, or you'll lose yourself completely." Reeves was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded once and returned to his position. Sarah watched him go, remembering when she'd asked a similar question of someone else, in a dusty compound at the edge of the world. That person was gone now, lost in an operation that would never appear in any official record. But her answer lived on, passed from one generation of warriors to the next. a small inheritance in a profession that dealt mostly in loss. The call came at 2:47 on a Thursday morning. Sarah was already awake, working through intelligence assessments for the Forge program's first real-world deployment when her secure phone buzzed. She recognized the number. It belonged to a man she'd worked with in a place that didn't officially exist. A man who only called when something had gone very wrong. "We have a situation," he said without preamble. "One of your operators, Staff Sergeant Chen, his sister is a relief worker. She's been taken in a border region we're not supposed to be operating in. Local government won't help. State Department can't acknowledge she exists in that location." Sarah felt the cold focus settle over her, the state of heightened awareness that had kept her alive through a dozen operations that should have killed her. "Where?" "I'm sending coordinates. The people holding her have connections to a network we've been tracking. They're not ideological. They're transactional, which means there might be a window before they move her to someone worse." "Timeline? 12 hours, maybe less." Sarah was already moving, pulling on clothes, gathering her gear. "Send me everything you have." 45 minutes later, she stood in a secure briefing room with Command Sergeant Major Drake, Master Sergeant Dalton, and 8 other operators she'd selected from the unit. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the map spread on the table. "This isn't an authorized operation," she told them quietly. "What I'm about to ask you to do exists in a gray area that could end careers and worse. The official position is that this rescue isn't happening. No one will blame you for walking away." Drake's jaw tightened. "Chen is one of ours. His family is our family. What's the plan, ma'am?" Sarah spread the intelligence package across the table. Satellite imagery, signals intercepts, the fragmentary picture of a criminal network operating in a region where American forces had no legal standing. The target location was a compound in rugged terrain, isolated, defensible, surrounded by people who'd spent generations learning to resist outside interference. "We don't go in shooting," she said. "This isn't a direct action problem. It's a relationship problem. I know people in that region, people who owe me, and people who might be willing to help if we approach them right." She looked up, meeting each operator's eyes in turn. "This is what the Forge program is actually about. Not teaching partner forces to fight our way. Learning to operate in their world, on their terms. We go in quiet, we work the network, and we find a way to get her out without starting a war we can't finish." The infiltration took 18 hours. They crossed borders that officially couldn't be crossed, using contacts Sarah had cultivated during years of operating in the shadows. They moved through villages where American uniforms would have meant death, dressed in local clothing, speaking through interpreters Sarah had worked with before. She led them to a man named Yusuf, a tribal elder who'd helped her during a previous operation, a man who had no love for Americans, but had a code of honor that transcended nationality. "You ask much," Yusuf said, after Sarah had explained the situation. "The men who hold this woman, they are dangerous. To help you is to make enemies." "I know," Sarah replied in his language. "I wouldn't ask if there was another way. But there's an innocent woman whose only crime was trying to help people. That matters to you." "I know it does." Yusuf was silent for a long time. The operators watched, understanding nothing of the words but everything of the weight. This was the moment, the fulcrum on which everything balanced. Finally Yusuf nodded. "For you, Shadow Walker. Because you stayed when others ran. Because you bled with us when you could have watched from far away." He provided guides. He provided intelligence. He provided the one thing that mattered most, legitimacy, in a region where foreign forces were seen as invaders rather than helpers. They reached the compound at dusk. Sarah went in first, alone, approaching under a flag of negotiation, while the operators held position in the surrounding hills. She spoke with the men holding Jennifer Chen, spoke in their language, understanding their grievances, looking for the angle that would let everyone walk away. It took 3 hours. 3 hours of negotiation, of cultural navigation, of finding the price that could be paid without violence. In the end, it was money and promises, compensation for perceived grievances, assurances that certain interests would be protected, the complex calculus of honor and profit that governed such transactions. Jennifer Chen walked out of that compound alive, supported by Sarah, and handed off to the Yuhua operators who would get her to safety. Behind them, the men who'd held her watched without interference, bound by an agreement they couldn't break without losing face. They were across the border by dawn. The official record showed nothing. A relief worker, briefly missing, had been recovered through diplomatic channels. No American military personnel had been involved. No operations had taken place in sovereign territory. That was the nature of the work. That was how it had always been. But something had changed in the unit. Word spread, as it always did in the tight-knit community of special operations. Not the details, those remained buried, but the essence. Major Keane had led them into a situation where conventional tactics would have failed, and she'd found another way. She'd used skills they didn't have, contacts they couldn't have built, methods they'd never been trained in. She'd shown them what the Forge program was actually about. On the last day before the unit's first official deployment under the new program, Command Sergeant Major Drake found Sarah in the empty Tactical Operations Center. She was reviewing final intelligence assessments, making notes, preparing to send her people into a situation where everything she'd taught them would be tested. "Ma'am, on behalf of the unit, I want to say something." "Go ahead, Sergeant Major." He paused, gathering his words. "When you first showed up, we didn't think you had any business commanding this unit. We judged you before we knew you, and that was wrong. I've served under a lot of officers in my time, good ones and bad ones. The good ones prove themselves through actions, not words. You've proven yourself." Sarah felt the weight of what he was saying, the significance of what it represented. In their world, respect was not freely given. It was won through demonstrated competence, through shared hardship, through the willingness to lead from the front when it mattered. "Thank you, Sergeant Major. That means a great deal." He nodded once, then reached into his pocket and withdrew something small, a worn unit coin, the kind that operators carry as tokens of brotherhood and shared service. "The teams wanted you to have this. It's from operations we've conducted together since you took command. We don't give these out to anyone outside the community." Sarah took the coin, feeling its weight in her palm. The metal was new, but the tradition behind it was ancient. On one side was the unit designation. On the other, a simple inscription, "Forged together." "I'll carry it with me," she said quietly, "always." That evening, Sarah walked alone through the training grounds one last time. The sun was setting over the North Carolina pines, casting long shadows across the empty ranges. Somewhere on the far side of the world, her people were preparing to deploy into uncertainty. Some of them would face situations no training could fully prepare them for. Some would have to make choices that would stay with them forever. She thought about the photograph in her footlocker, Fatima and her fighters, the mountains that had been her home for 2 years, the people she'd lost along the way. She thought about Jennifer Chen, safe now with her family, and the operators who'd followed her into ambiguity without hesitation. She thought about what it meant to lead, not the abstractions of command philosophy, but the daily reality of sending people into danger and hoping you'd prepared them well enough. The choice to stand in front when standing behind would be safer. The choice to be worthy of the trust placed in you, even when that trust had to be earned in the hardest possible way. The unit deployed 3 days later. Sarah stood on the flight line as the aircraft loaded, watching the men and women she'd trained file up the ramp into the gray belly of the transport. Some of them nodded to her as they passed. A few shook her hand. Master Sergeant Dalton stopped and held her gaze for a long moment, then rendered a salute that had nothing to do with regulation and everything to do with respect. She saluted back and watched until the ramp closed and the engines roared to life. The aircraft taxied down the runway, gathering speed, and then lifted into the darkening sky, carrying 63 operators toward whatever waited for them on the other side of the world. Sarah remained on the flight line long after the aircraft had disappeared into the clouds. She thought about each of them, their faces, their stories, the particular strengths and vulnerabilities they carried. She thought about the partner forces they'd be working with, people who'd never met an American they could trust, who'd have to decide whether these new arrivals were different from all the others who'd come and gone. She hoped she'd prepared them well enough. She'd given them everything she had, not just tactics and techniques, but the harder lessons. The patience required to build trust across cultural chasms, the humility to learn from people whose experience looked nothing like their own, the understanding that in this kind of warfare, relationships were weapons, and respect was ammunition. Sarah received reports throughout the deployment, official assessments and unofficial messages, the dual streams of information that flowed in any special operations community. The news was good. Her people were making connections, building networks, finding ways to work with partner forces that previous rotations had written off as unreliable. Then, 3 months in, everything changed. A joint operation went wrong. Ambush, casualties. The kind of situation that revealed whether training held up under fire. Sarah read the after-action report with her heart in her throat. The American element had taken fire from an unexpected direction. The partner force element had frozen, uncertain, on the verge of breaking. In that moment, everything she'd taught them was tested. Master Sergeant Dalton had made the call. Instead of pulling his people back to safety and leaving the partner force to fend for themselves, the tactical choice, the survivable choice, he'd pushed forward. He'd rallied the indigenous fighters, spoken to their commander in the phrases Sarah had drilled into them, reminded them that they were not abandoned, that Americans stayed. They'd fought out together, 3 American wounded, 2 partner force killed, but the element intact, the mission completed. And something else? Something harder to quantify. Trust. The partner force commander had looked at Dalton in the aftermath and said, in broken English, "You stayed." That was what it meant. That was what it had always meant. The unit rotated home 6 months later. Sarah met them on the flight line, watching them file down the ramp. Thinner, harder, carrying the weight of everything they'd seen and done. She shook hands, spoke quiet words, felt the texture of experience that now bound them together. Dalton was one of the last off the aircraft. He walked up to her and stood for a moment, not speaking. Then he reached into his pocket and withdrew something. A piece of cloth, embroidered with symbols she recognized. A tribal marker. A token of adoption into a community that didn't easily accept outsiders. "The partner force commander wanted you to have this," Dalton said. "He said to tell you that your teaching reached them, that because of what we learned from you, his people trust Americans now. He said that's worth more than any victory." Sarah took the cloth, feeling its weight, understanding what it represented. The work wasn't about her. It never had been. It was about the ripples that spread outward from every act of genuine respect. Every moment of staying when leaving would have been easier. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for carrying it forward." In the years that followed, Sarah Keane became something of a legend in the special operations community. Not the kind of legend celebrated in official histories, nothing so public, but the kind whispered about in team rooms and training compounds, passed from one generation of operators to the next. They called her different things in different places. The operators who'd served under her called her ma'am, spoken with a respect that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with the quiet valor of a woman who'd proven herself in the hardest school there was. The partner forces she'd worked with across the globe had their own names for her, words in a dozen languages that all meant roughly the same thing. The one who stays. She retired after 22 years of service, with a record that would remain classified for decades and memories that would never fade. On her last day in uniform, she walked one final time through the training grounds where she'd shaped so many warriors, and she thought about the journey that had brought her here. She thought about the first day. Standing in that briefing room, with the rain on the windows and the skepticism in the air, she thought about the doubts she'd faced, not just from others, but from herself. The question that every pioneer carries, am I good enough? Do I belong here? She'd found her answer in the doing, in the quiet, patient work of proving her worth, one day at a time, in the operators who'd followed her, the lives she'd saved, the relationships she'd built, in the understanding that courage wasn't about being fearless, it was about being afraid and moving forward anyway. Sarah Keane walked off the post for the last time as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the empty parade ground. In her pocket, she carried a worn coin inscribed with words that had become a kind of truth. Forged together, she'd earned the right to carry it. And somewhere, in a briefing room or a training compound or a remote outpost in a country most Americans couldn't find on a map, another soldier was looking at another skeptical audience and preparing to prove herself again. The cycle continued, the work went on, and the lesson, the only lesson that truly mattered, remained the same. Courage isn't found in the proving, it's found in the showing up, day after day, doubt after doubt, until the doubters become believers, until you can't be serious becomes I'm glad you're here, until the question is no longer whether you belong, but how many others you can bring with you. History doesn't remember the quiet acts of courage, but maybe it should. Maybe that's what stories are for, to remember the ones who stood when standing was hardest, who proved their worth not through words, but through the patient daily work of being exactly who they said they were. She never called herself a hero, but every operator who knew her still tells the story, because courage like that doesn't fade, it's passed on.